Hey everybody! So today we're going to talk about boundaries in the natal chart. Recently I've had clients that have come to me for full natal chart readings, and whenever I do a full natal chart reading for somebody, I always like to ask if there's anything that they really want me to touch on. Make sure I touch on, because while I'm going to go over the whole chart, if you don't have anything that you specifically want me to look at or really zone in on, I'm just going to do what pops out to me, right? But recently when I've asked this question, people have mentioned that they wanted to talk about boundaries, or they wanted to know about boundaries and why maybe they didn't have very good boundaries, or why they feel like people walked all over their boundaries, or why they maybe couldn't enforce them well. So this has been something that has come up recently, and it's something that you can see in the natal chart. Now, mind you, none of this is universal. The stuff I'm going to mention, you might not have boundary issues in these areas, but these are places that you can look for this kind of thing if you feel like you do. These are the places that I would start anyway. Okay, so the first place I would start is Neptune. I would look for Neptune in the chart. And the reason for this is Neptune in the planet being the what needs to be expressed, in the sign being how it needs to be expressed, and in the house being where or what area of life it needs to be expressed. Neptune is a what? Neptune is a planet. So Neptune is fluid. It lacks boundaries. It's boundaryless. It doesn't know boundaries. It dissolves. Neptune dissolves. So where Neptune falls in your natal chart by house might give you an idea of where or what area of life you could lack boundaries, and the sign would be how, whatever sign Neptune is in might show how that happens. Now again, Neptune doesn't have to go this way in your natal chart. It may not show this, but if somebody were asking about boundaries and why they lacked them or what have you, this is the first place I would look, for sure. So if we're talking about personal boundaries, which is what a lot of these people were talking about, we're asking about why people didn't respect their boundaries, why when they tried to enforce them, nobody listened, those kinds of things, or even maybe not even totally being clear about what their boundaries are in the first place. I noticed that this came up a lot with first house Neptune people and fourth house Neptune people. Now, this makes sense. First house is the house, it's like the self. So people that have Neptune in the first house, they might have a harder time with personal boundaries. They might not really know how to enforce them as well. They might be more inclined to dissolve them. They might feel like when they do enforce them, they're walked all over. In some cases, it might be them dissolving through other people's boundaries. It could go that way. It could. Though oftentimes it tends to be more people not paying attention to their boundaries, or even the first house Neptune person not really knowing what their boundaries are in the first place. The fourth house I bring into the equation because the fourth house is like the core of the person, right? It's the core of your being. So it does seem like Neptune in the fourth could have an inclination towards not having boundaries at its core, not understanding them, not being able to implement them, perhaps not even knowing what they are. Fourth house could also be family boundaries though too, like there might be a lack of boundaries with the family, or lack, it depends on everything going on in the chart, but those are the ways that my mind would go. Now there are some things that can change this a little bit, like I think it was in 1989 when Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune were all conjunct one another. I think, and then there was a time where Saturn and Neptune were conjunct one another, and Uranus was close, but it wasn't as close. Now, when you got Saturn in the mix with Neptune, that could change things a little bit. I could see that it'll either dissolve through the boundaries of Saturn, and Saturn is all about boundaries, right? So Neptune would either dissolve through Saturn's boundaries in that case, or Saturn might strengthen Neptune's boundaries. It really would depend on the whole chart as to how that might go, and the sign. This is everything going on. The sign that would have been happening in Capricorn, which actually probably strengthens it a little bit, but still it depends on everything going on in the chart. as to how this would have, how this will go, but it could change things a little bit. So you'll definitely want to look, those are just a couple of examples, but you'll definitely want to look at what house Neptune falls in your chart, because that might give you an idea of the area of life where the boundary issue actually stems. Like, okay, we'll do another one. Like, let's say you've got Neptune in the 7th house. 7th house is relationships, close one-on-one relationships with other people. So, and this could be like close friendships, romantic relationships, business partnerships, even family relationships can be seen here sometimes. So Neptune in this house, the person might lack boundaries in these close one-on-one relationships. They might have people walking all over them in close one-on-one relationships. They might not really know what their boundaries are in the first place. In some cases, it could be the Neptune person dissolving the boundaries of other people. That could certainly happen as well. We'll do the 8th, because the 8th is kind of similar to the 7th in terms of other people. The 8th is like deep soul merging relationships. The 8th house, and because of that, right, the 8th house doesn't really have a whole lot of boundaries as it is. So Neptune in the 8th, I feel like could dissolve those boundaries further. Now, depending on the relationship in question, right, because the 8th house is a lot of things, but it is deep and soul merging relationships. It's also like the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. 12th house being the unconscious, 4th house being deeply conscious. The 8th house is kind of a bridge between the two. So Neptune falling there, depending on the sort of deep soul merging the person is wanting to do, the Neptune 8th house person, this may or may not be good. Or the lack of boundaries there may be appropriate. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It really depends on the relationship that we're talking about, and those kinds of things. So, but it might not be for the 8th house Neptune person. It might not be totally conscious to them. It might not even be totally conscious to them if somebody else in like a deep soul merging relationship is walking all over their boundaries. Or things like that. Again, Neptune doesn't have to go this way. It can be other things too, but these are just some things that I might think of if I was looking at Neptune in any of these houses. But again, you'd want to look at Neptune in any of the houses of the natal chart to kind of get an idea. If you've got boundary issues, that's the first place I'd look. Pisces, planets in Pisces. Pisces is a how. Signs are how energy is it what how energy needs to be expressed, like yeah. So Pisces expresses itself in a fluid way. It also dissolves. It also lacks boundaries. So it's very fluid. So any planets that fall in Pisces could possibly lack boundaries. It doesn't have to go that way. It doesn't have to, but it could. So if you're like, I've got some issues with boundaries, people respecting them, definitely look at your planets in Pisces to see if you've got any there. Take a look and see if that might be where some of the issue comes into play. Okay, so the next one is the 12th house. Talk about that. The 12th house is unconscious. It is it's kind of like there's a concept of oneness within the 12th house, right? And that concept of oneness doesn't have any boundaries. So if you've got somebody with planets in the 12th, and specifically, like, I would think like the sun, the moon, the chart ruler, having a couple of planets there would make somebody a more 12th house heavy person. The more 12th house heavy you are, the more likely I think you are to perhaps have some boundary issues. Now, this might be, the 12th house person getting their boundaries walked all over, or not knowing how to enforce them in the first place. Really, with the 12th house, you might really be looking at somebody who doesn't really know how to enforce them in the first place, or really even know what they are. But you could also see a 12th house person kind of walking all over other people's too. I wouldn't rule that out as being possible, since the 12th house does shoot for oneness. So I would definitely, if you've got issues with boundaries, feel like you do, or you're looking at somebody's chart who does, definitely look in these places first. I would. Now, if you do have like a boundary, if you're looking at your own chart and you know you got boundary issues, or you're looking at a chart of another person and you feel like they have boundary issues, look at Saturn. Saturn is like Saturn's all about boundaries. So wherever Saturn falls in the chart might give you an idea of how the person can better enforce boundaries. I would certainly focus on it, especially if boundaries are a real issue, like the people mentioning it to me and making it known that I've got an issue with this. Kind of like help me, you know. Definitely look at where Saturn falls, because Saturn could give you a lot of clues as to how to strengthen boundaries in general. It really could. By house, by sign, by aspects made, things like that. By all means, if you've got something like Saturn square Neptune, I would definitely look at like the midpoint for that. That might help. Because essentially, like in Saturn squaring Neptune, you've got like boundaries are at odds with lack of boundaries. So I would definitely look at the midpoint between the two planets for that, if you happen to have that in your chart. But yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to get going. If you want to follow us on Instagram, you can find us at Let's Fuck with Astrology. I am at Saturn Season Astrology on Instagram. Natalie is at Paterno Astrology on Instagram. If you want to like or subscribe or whatever the fuck people do with videos on YouTube, you can find us by searching for Let's Fuck with Astrology in the YouTube search bar. If you do the Reddit thing, come join us on the subreddit Let's Fuck with Astrology. And if you're interested in the star cards, go to letsfuckwithastrology.com/star-cards. Okay, y'all. I'll see y'all later.